Ladies and gentlemen, let's Gaming Cynical video. Let's just discuss frame rate yet again. Now this time from the perspective of the Oculus founder, Palmer Luckey. Now, Palmer has considered 30 frames a second a failure. Those are his words. And frame rate has been in the news consistently recently. And as we all know, this started when the next generation consoles were first unveiled. Well, unveiled is a strong word, but their specs were leaked, and ever since then we've not really been able to move off the subject because there's always these concessions that seem to be made. And there's a lot of debate of, well, is 30 frames a second acceptable? And, well, Palmer believes no. In fact, he says it's a failure, and those are his exact words. I'm going to read you out a quote. He said, "For VR you need a much higher frame rate than a typical screen. 60 frames a second is definitely enough, but you see huge improvements up to 90 to 120 Hz. And even beyond that you could see small improvements." Now obviously that's for virtual reality, and this mirrors some stuff that John Carmack's discussed previously. We'll get into that in just a moment. However, moving away from virtual reality, he still continues. Virtual reality is going to need a much higher frame rate than consoles. Although, even at consoles or traditional PC games, I don't think 30 frames a second is smart. He goes on to say it's not a good artistic decision, and it's a failure. I think you start seeing diminishing returns between 90 and 120 Hz, so in the foreseeable VR is going to be ending up somewhere in that range. In fact, another member of the Oculus team actually mentioned last year that there are a lot of challenges like resolution. It's a big one for current dev kit. You can't imagine what it's going to look like in 4K, and it's not that far away. It's not now, but it's coming. So, in my opinion, is 30 frames a second a failure? Well, it's really difficult being a console developer. If you've followed along listening to the comments of games developers on console, they generally fit into two categories. One is that they just say, look, we've got to choose the frame rate we're going with simply because, well, we need it to achieve the visual clarity in the games. Now, there's another group of individuals who will actually say that 30 frames a second is actually good for gameplay. And it's actually what Ready at Dawn have said with the Order 1886, which I actually think is just totally ludicrous. I just physically don't understand it. Here's the thing. As much as the Xbox One is getting a lot of flack for the whole resolution and frame rate incident, the PlayStation 4 isn't really that much better. It's getting slightly higher resolutions, which is obviously great. You know, the closer to 1080p, the better. But the reality of the matter is, these are fixed function machines. And I was going to cover this as a separate story, but it's very little substance, so I just figured I might as well bundle it in here, and it's a little bit of a side piece. But Corey Yu, who of course now is working for Naughty Dog, said that they're, you know, pushing The Last of Us to like 60 frames a second and beyond. But here's the problem. As great as that is, it's a PS3 game, and I'm not taking anything away from the title. It's going to look great, and I'm really looking forward to doing some analysis on it, because quite frankly speaking, at times The Last of Us on the PS3 really dived in terms of the frame rate. But I don't necessarily think that we should be getting like amazingly excited at the prospect of a title which is basically a remastered port of a previous generation game running at 1080p 60. I do understand, however, I mean, I loved the original Last of Us, I honestly did, and there were times, as I've mentioned in other videos, that I honestly just could not believe. In fact, I think I even said in my first impressions of The Last of Us that I just couldn't believe what the PS3 was managing to do visually. But you could tell that the frame rate was just getting ravaged. I mean, it was literally like you could actually feel the frame rate dip. Like, sometimes you're like, that looks like it's gone a little bit. But in some parts in The Last of Us, you could actually physically feel the controls start taking effect. And if you've played a title on a PC that's, say, 60 frames or above, and then you've gone and played it on console, which I've done many times for my graphics analysis, it's quite weird, actually. Sometimes it can be a little bit strange because you're just not used to the fluidity of the controls. And arguably, especially in an FPS, like, I absolutely bloody am awful with a joypad now when it comes to FPS. I mean, I am pretty bad at FPS as a whole because I just don't play them anymore, especially competitively. I haven't played them for years, and boy, you suffer when you do that. You just forget all these little subtle nuances. But even so, if you're even playing a game both using pad, and some titles do definitely lend themselves to joypad better, at least in my opinion. I personally found Watch Dogs, for example, a little bit better on pad on the PC, my personal opinion. You could definitely feel the difference. And Watch Dogs on the consoles, I will say to Ubisoft's credit, despite all of this talk about visual downgrading, I actually felt that the frame rate was pretty damn solid. I ran frame rate comparisons, as you can see on the channel, and even through ridiculous amounts of explosions, cars blowing up, you know, pretty much at points I was certain when I was doing these tests, when we were all, because we were actually, there's a small group of us who are actually filming this so we could actually help each other to make sure that all the gameplay was the same. And there were a couple of times we were like, okay, fairly sure that the frame rate dipped, but no, it didn't. Even through manual checking, because at points I was like, maybe our detection methods missed 1 or 2 drop frames, but no, they didn't, and it was remaining 30. There were a couple of drops, however, and there were a lot of torn frames, but generally speaking, I was pretty damn impressed. And this brings us half around the block, because the question then you've got to ask yourself, are you willing to sacrifice the look of something like, say, The Last of Us on the PS3, and would you be willing instead to go for a higher frame rate and, well, crappier graphics? I've got an article running at the moment, I'll link it in the description just 'cause in case you've missed it, where I explore frame rate and resolution. I explain what the differences are. And what I did in one clip is I took a section of gameplay from a couple of different games, Infamous, for example, Second Son, and Trine 2, Wolfenstein, and Watch Dogs, and you're going to say, yeah, but they're totally different games, but the frame rate is the main point. And you can see that when you slow it down 4 times, the difference in fluidity is still pretty impressive. The frame rate seems a lot more consistent, and you can definitely start noticing that. And Infamous, by the way, also definitely has a lot of frame drops as well. Not that I'm really blaming the guys over at Sucker Punch, because let's face it, it's a first-generation game. But these concessions, unfortunately, are part and parcel of it. Do you remember when the Xbox 360 and PlayStation 3 were launched? Sony were making a big deal of 1080p output for the PS4, whereas I don't know how many games ended up being 1080p, but I'm pretty sure out of the big ones you could probably count them on 2 hands at most. I'm certainly not going to bother to research it, but there were a lot of titles, there were a couple of even reporting themselves to be 1080p, but they weren't. They were running at resolutions like 960 via 1080, so yeah, they're 1080 in one respect, but not the other. And the Xbox 360, as much as I love Jay Allard and his original press event that he held with the Xbox 360, he was making a really big deal of 720p. And there were some games that definitely were 720p, but there were a lot of games that just weren't. In fact, a lot of even the big first-party titles for the Xbox 360, even like in the mid-life of the system, were running at like 600p. With all of that said, however, do I think it's a failure? Do I agree with Palmer? It's a really difficult decision. Developers are quite literally in a point where they're spending millions developing the game. In fact, quite a lot of titles are a lot more than millions. They're running into, you know, the hundreds of millions. And the bottom line is, as harsh as this is, and this is something I discussed in the article from other developers, the bottom line is, you can't put frame rate on the back of a box. In other words, you can't pick up a box, look at the frame rate, and see the fluidity of the game. And even if you look at videos, it doesn't transition. YouTube has a frame rate limit of 30 frames a second, and even if it was 60, hell, even if YouTube handled a million frames a second. It could handle up to that. Let's just be really stupid about this. It doesn't necessarily transition to the fact that you can actually demonstrate how it's playing. I'm not really sure how I stand on the frame rate thing. I don't think some games necessarily require 60, as in they are a requirement, because I think some RPGs, for example JRPGs, they just don't require 60. I think they look better at 60, but I don't think they require 60. But what does start to piss me off, as someone who's into technology, is how we're starting to get these, a lot of developers, not just Ready at Dawn, but there are quite a few, who have said stuff like, you know, we're not making a film here. Or sorry, we're going for more of a filmic look here. And so we can go with a lower frame rate. And it's just, oh dear. With all of that said, I also understand that they are working with limited hardware. The bottom line is, the PS4 and Xbox One have been built on a budget, and I think it's kind of funny, because if the mass market would have accepted a console that was like $200, just for example, more expensive, the hardware would have been significantly more powerful. Hell, even $100 would probably have made quite the difference. Just for example, as consumers, so in other words, not buying the parts OEM, not buying the parts in, you know, getting basically good deals on the parts, you can buy a complete gaming PC for about $700. In fact, I've got a guide of it on the website currently for the June one. You can Google that if you so you can search for it on the channel, and you can literally make a PC that's got a GTX 770 in it or AMD equivalent, 8 GB of memory, a pretty damn good CPU, and so on and so on. And that's literally if you have to buy every single component. Certainly if you already have, say, a case, if you've got a good hard drive and so on, you could probably shave about $150, $200 off the price. And I'm not trying to turn this into a PC versus console, because I honestly believe they've both got their place. I'm just merely trying to illustrate that in technology, a couple of $100s can make a lot of difference. And one thought I've just had, I'm certainly not gonna do like major research on this, but doesn't it just make you wonder if Microsoft had not put the extra money that the console cost for the Xbox One? The Xbox One roughly cost about £80 more expensive on launch than the PS4, right? Doesn't it just make you wonder, rather than going with Kinect, rather than going for all of this stuff, if they just said, right, we're going to make the most powerful console that we can possibly make, they'd have put all of that extra price, if you will, into the actual hardware. They would have made a pretty damn monstrous system. Anyway, guys, I think that's just about it for this particular video. I've become a bit ranty, which is not necessarily normally how I create videos, as a lot of people know, but I just kind of felt like unleashing a little bit on this video, to be honest with you. So, hopefully you've enjoyed it. I'll see you soon. Take care, and bye for now.